Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, founder of Thrive Meetings and Events and the Eating at a Meeting podcast. Every week, I talk to individuals that are doing fantastic things in food and beverage throughout the food system. And this month, for month of March, I am celebrating Women's HERstory Month and highlighting 10 women that are doing fantastic things in food and beverage. And this woman, wrong way, right to the left of me here is Aliza Tuttle. And she is a volunteer with the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition's Food Action Team. And during the early days of the pandemic, she helped start a group that used crowdfunding to buy meals from locally owned restaurants and then give the meals to anyone who needed a gift of food. I love that, a gift of food. The group has raised over $300,000 and has given out more than 30,000 meals so far. So Aliza, thank you so much for what you're doing and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is so exciting.
You're welcome. So tell us about the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition's Food Action Team.
Sure. Yeah. So the Corvallis Sustainability Coalition is a network of businesses, nonprofit organizations, faith communities, educational institutions, and local governments and individuals who are working together to create a sustainable community. The Sustainability Coalition was started through a community convening process in 2008, at which the community created a framework for action. And then the framework outlined 12 different areas for action that the community could mobilize within. And the Food Action Team is one of them. Okay. So we're just a loosely organized group of volunteers who have a passion for food, food equity, local food, supporting food businesses, and using food as a driver for community sustainability.
And I think it's really important because I think when people hear the word sustainability, they mean green, right? And they mean plastic aware and cutting plastic out and stuff like that. But sustainability is actually about the communities themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's one of the action teams is community inclusion, and that's really, if we weren't in the Food Action Team, we'd be in the community inclusion, which is really a sustainable community is one that thrives together and has lower rates of income inequality and high rates of cohesion and cooperative spirit. So that's the mission of It's On Us Corvallis, is to build community and help the economy through food. So it's more about community sustainability and less about food waste or recycling or things like that.
Right. But the Food Action Team, it's really, because you started in the pandemic, I think that really shows we saw with what we saw in the news and our friends and family potentially that actually experienced food insecurity because of the pandemic, and your team went into action.
Yeah, exactly. So do you want me to tell a little background?
Please do.
Okay. So like you said, we started just as a text message between 3 volunteers in the Food Action Team. The 3 of us were lucky enough to be affected in ways that didn't impact our housing or our income from the pandemic, but I didn't have a job at the time. And we were all impacted, I think, emotionally during that time. And the way that the group started was just sitting in the discomfort of hearing about our neighbors and our favorite restaurants and our community members feeling so economically impacted and powerless, and us sitting with not losing income, having a very comfortable place to live, and just thinking, like, what can we do? So we started just by answering the call from our local business community by buying as much takeout as we could. And then our fridges totally filled up and we got sick of takeout and we're like, this is not sustainable. So then we started buying takeout and donating it to the first responders, so the hospital and the older adult care communities in town. And then we thought, it's not just us. There's got to be people in our amazingly well-resourced community. We live in a small college town, so there's college students and then service industry folks and then professors and people who work in well-paid positions at the university, and their positions were not impacted financially. So we said, why don't we ask them for their stagnant money and circulate it in the economy by purchasing restaurant meals and giving them out to anyone who needs a meal. And we were really strategic about anyone who needs a meal because, like you said, it's the gift of food. Yes, there's hunger, especially when folks are losing income, but there's also this idea that when you give someone a free meal or when someone gets a free meal, it's this feeling of inclusivity and belonging, and neighbors giving to neighbors has a very different feeling than going to the church food pantry or feeling grateful for some computer system that decided that you were eligible for more SNAP. So we were really careful about framing it in a way that would bring the community together and feel like we're giving you this gift with the expectation that you're going to pay it forward when you can, whatever that looks like. And let's get creative with how we can use food to build community cohesion in that way.
That's so interesting. And I know we were talking about it before. I mean, it helped the restaurants. It helped the people. It got them in. You and I were talking, I think it was like a month ago, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of individuals who've never had to experience going to a food bank, going to stand in line, right? And I'm not trying to diminish the people who have been to a food bank as well. I mean, that's got to be heart-wrenching in and of itself in general, but all these new people who were experiencing and they didn't know how to process it, even do it, correct?
Totally, yeah. And they also didn't even know where to go. Like, where do I go? There's a huge group of people who are making it. They're paycheck to paycheck, but they don't use the food pantries or the soup kitchen to get by month to month. They have maybe just a paycheck that barely cuts it, or they have SNAP. And so they've never had to use that safety net of the food pantry. And then when they all of a sudden don't get that $350 paycheck twice a week that they depend on, there's no savings there. The vast majority of Americans don't have savings. And so we were just hearing stories of people who just didn't, like, what do I even Google? I don't even know where to go. And so we thought, rather than increasing the bifurcation or increasing the separation between people who were affected economically and people who weren't affected economically by sending them to different places in our town, let's try to just keep folks going to the places that they usually went to. They usually went to the grocery store and they usually went to restaurants to get food. Let's just continue to provide food aid in those normal places and also take the burden off the food pantries and the soup kitchens that all of a sudden didn't have any volunteers. And we're seeing a drastic increase in need. So just adding another layer of protection to the community in that way.
And you started using cards, right? Like a credit card type thing? How does that work?
Yeah. So, first we started by just asking folks to stand in line, unfortunately. And then we took a step back and realized, like, asking people to stand in line for food during a pandemic is not the best. How can we reevaluate? And we also did surveys and listened to what the community who used the service wanted. And so we partnered with a smartphone app. It's this amazing startup company that started in Portland during the pandemic as well to decrease fees for restaurants during when we couldn't accept cash. A lot of the cash-only businesses all of a sudden saw 4% of their profit going to credit card companies, which is a huge hit to food and beverage business bottom line, if you know the profit and loss. Yeah. So this payment startup app just charges 1.5%, which is huge. And they wrote us software to help us distribute gift cards. So it's on people's smartphone. Anyone can use it. the cashiers don't know if you're using a gift card or if you're using your bank account. And it's super easy and it's contactless also. So rather than giving folks another thing to lose potentially or another thing to keep track of, it's super streamlined and anyone can use it, and it's better for the restaurants too.
And then how about those individuals who don't have a phone?
Yeah, great question. So we're working closely with the social service agencies in town to try to plug into programs that provide smartphones and data. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but that's definitely something on the docket. And we also know, I just saw, I think today, that 97% of Americans have a smartphone with data. And it's something like 75% of people in poverty even have a smartphone with data.
Wow.
So there's definitely people who we're leaving out, and it's definitely an equity issue. And again, we're working with a smartphone to try to figure out a way to do coupons that don't require data or coupons that don't require connection to a bank account. Okay. And that's also part of the resiliency aspect, because we know that during a time of disaster, climate disaster, human disaster, whatever, we're going to need multiple ways and flexibility. And the less we can rely on one way, the more resilient we are. So we're working on that with an eye towards wildfire season that's coming up.
Well, that's so true. And then I'm thinking of even like the tornadoes, and because I'm on the East Coast, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, and the flooding when power goes out, or even in Texas when the snowstorm hit, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And there's only so much time you have on your phone for battery charging, right?
Right. Yeah. So how do you get food, and how do people who are providing food get paid for their services as well? How do we minimize the disruption and just kind of smooth operations? And I think using technology like this is definitely one way, in addition to all the other ways that we already have.
Well, and I want to go back to, I had asked you a question before we got on, is like, because you said you actually experienced insecurity and poverty personally. And was that even before the pandemic? And has that actually, is it helping fuel what you're doing?
Yeah. Good question. Yes. So, I mean, many times in my life, but I think most recently, when I first moved to Portland, I got hired as a cook at a little grocery store cafe. And I slowly made my way to general manager. And I got paid $15 an hour to manage 15 employees and a business with like $1 million in revenue. And after doing that for about a year, I looked around at other management positions and thought, this is not financially sustainable for myself. I have got to make a change. So I went back to grad school to pivot my career. And in grad school, I didn't have any savings, obviously. And I got a research assistantship, thank goodness, that I paid for my tuition. And it was 19 hours a week, so half time. And I got paid about $800 or $900 from that assistantship. So
a week or a month?
A month.
Okay. Wow.
A month. Yeah. So living in Portland on $900 a month.
Right.
Totally fine when I was sharing like a basement room with my partner. We paid $650 each in rent. But when I decided that I really needed to focus on my studies and that my relationship wasn't working out anymore, I moved and lived by myself and shared a house with others, and my rent was $800 a month.
Wow.
Yeah. So I now had $100 left per month. And so that's not enough.
Definitely
not enough. And also that the room that I found was like a 45-minute bike commute from campus. So I biked to campus, spent 6 hours in lecture, and then worked for 4 hours and biked home for 45 minutes, and then had 3 hours of homework at least. And where in that is there time to cook?
Right.
There's a food pantry on campus, but it's only open a few hours a day, some days a week. Now I think it's open way more. But when I was going to school, it's like 3 days a week for 3 hours. And some of the lectures that I have are 3 hours. So I could be in lecture the entire time that it was open. And I do remember sometimes like in that 10-minute break that we get in lecture, like running down to the food pantry, seeing if the line was too long. If the line wasn't too long, like standing in line a little bit, stuffing food in my bag, and then like running back to lecture.
Wow.
being like, oh, I had a stomach ache and I had to go to the bathroom or whatever.
Right.
And also so there's that time aspect. And also when I was in school, I didn't really have time to cook that much. So I think I still have bags of masa and beans that I got at the food pantry. And it's the financial poverty piece. And there's also a time aspect in there. And
right.
That's what we're learning, or that's what we're, responding to as well with this program is people in poverty are mostly working, and they're mostly working low wage jobs like I was before I went to school. And they mostly don't have time to cook. So the best thing that we could do is give them access to hot meals that they can just bring home, put it in front of their family, go to bed 45 minutes earlier than they normally would, and be done with food for the day.
I love that because I remember being in Atlanta and I worked at Cook's Warehouse part-time as a cooking instructor and assistant. Yeah. And we worked with the local community as well. And a lot of people, even with SNAP, you can, and I'm not sure if we're in Portland, but you can go to the farmer's market and you can get double your SNAP dollars at the farmer's market versus going to the grocery store. But one of the problems that I learned in doing that is that a lot of people, either don't have the equipment to cook that food, nor do they know how to cook that food.
Right.
So, and especially if we're talking again with no water and no heat and whatever, you don't have electricity to cook, those hot meals actually are so much better.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And even us folk in our position here, we totally know, like some days you get home from work, regardless of your work, and you were just like, all I want is a burrito.
Right.
And if you don't have that flexibility or the community safety net to be like, I get it, here's a burrito. And here's a burrito for you and your kids or your elderly parents that you're caring for all of a sudden. It just feels so much more isolating when there's not those neighbors who are like, yeah, we get it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And how did the restaurants take to it?
Oh my gosh. Well, at first, I think accidentally it worked out well. At first, we walked up to the restaurants with a check for $1,000 and was like, can you please accept this check? Go cash it, spend it do whatever you need to do with it, and make us 100 meals with whatever you have in your fridge, knowing that the shutdowns happened really suddenly and they had backstock that they didn't know what to do with. And a lot of the other programs were very restrictive with how they could use their funds.
Okay.
So a group of people just coming in and saying like, we're not going to ask for reporting. We're not going to make you pay it back. Just do what you need to do with it. And then like spread the word of your restaurant through our social media, which is not connected to your marketing. And we're going to get 100 different faces through and we also, so that was part of it. They really enjoyed that part. And then later it became $3,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. 300 meals, $3,000.
Okay.
Some restaurants took really easily to it. They totally got it. Other restaurants, especially restaurants owned by people who didn't speak English as their first language or who had moved here to the US and started a restaurant, it was a little bit more difficult to get them to accept the money.
Right.
And it took legwork. It took cultural translation. And in some cases it took literal translation. And in other cases it took us going to their regulars or another community partner and allowing that person to vouch for us.
Right.
And I think that's the difference that these small community organizations bring, which is that like, we're willing to do that legwork and we're wanting to because we want to build those connections. And now those restaurants love it. Like they were first adopters for the smartphone app, which means that they're first in line to get a lower credit card rate, which saves them money.
Right.
And yeah, they're just great continuous partners.
That's awesome. Yeah. I need to, and I will put it in here. I'll send it to you too. I interviewed a gentleman from Toronto who opened up his venue to actually refugees. Oh, yeah. And this is during the Syrian refugees, and because they were living in hotels and they had no place to cook. And so he opened it up and he let them come in and cook, and then they started selling meals and whatever. And it just adds so much more community, right? They get to cook. their traditional meals, share them with friends and family, and actually make money. I mean, I don't think how much money they made, but they made their money back on what they spent, right? But that was a fantastic program, Len, from the Depanair.
Yeah,
to say it correctly. But yeah,
that's a great point too. Like a lot of those who go to food pantries and soup kitchens are disproportionately people of color. They're disproportionately new immigrants, and they're disproportionately people who may not be familiar with not American, but like a simple cuisine that we have here. And the volunteers are not usually representative of those who go to those food pantries and soup kitchens for food. So it's this cultural mismatch, and partnering with up to 30 restaurants at a time and allowing someone to choose not only what restaurant they go to, but what menu items they want, opens up a whole nother piece of equity and of cultural responsiveness that I think this program does really well. And it also allows for all types of dietary stuff. Like when we were first organizing the meals, I was literally on the phone with people who are getting the meals saying, what are your dietary needs? You have a child who's sensory sensitive and they can only eat plain pasta. Okay, let me find a restaurant that can do that. And it was like logistics beyond belief. And now people know where their kid is going to feel safe in the environment with the food. They know where their dietary needs are going to get met. They know which restaurant's kosher, which restaurant's halal, all of that stuff. And it's just so seamless. And I think that this program is really unique in that way. And that I know that food pantries and soup kitchens desperately want to do that. But having experienced that myself, like you can't get enough volunteers in the world to be able to accommodate every single person's dietary needs.
Right. Yeah, that's for sure. Meeting planners understand that very clearly. Yeah. And so do chefs. Okay. So, and again, when we were talking before the show and when you were filling out my questionnaire, you mentioned something about, and I think this goes back to your schooling and what you studied, is that the food system in general. And you said something about we may get near expired food waste from church kitchens or cafeteria style meals from large soup kitchens, or using a different payment method at the grocery store where we aren't trusted to make our own food choices. And that goes all the way back to the 70s.
Yeah. Yep. So some people who have totally shaped how I view the food system are some authors like Janet Poppendieck, who wrote a book in 1998 called Sweet Charity. And then Andy Fisher, who is now a local to Portland writer, who also writes about the food system. And then the Oregon Food Bank here is amazing with their research and just kind of pushing back on the narrative of what emergency food system is now and what it can be. But yeah, so the emergency food system really hasn't been updated since the 1970s. And that means that the income requirements haven't really been updated to reflect the realities of what folks are getting paid and what costs are now. And just a quick example there, like in the 1970s, you didn't have as many expenses as you do now. You didn't have a cell phone bill, you didn't have an internet bill, food was much less expensive. And those costs are not accounted for in the equation that determines what is eligible for food stamps. And then same with what we were talking about earlier about time poverty. That just wasn't really a thing. There was this idea of the poor are single men sleeping on the street. That was the national narrative. And we're really trying to change that. We know that the majority of people who are poor are working more than one job. They're working low wage, part-time job. They don't have healthcare and they don't really have time. And they're usually moms and they usually have kids. So working to update the rules to reflect the realities of what, would serve people who are really in financial constraints right now. I think it's something that this program is trying to just add. We're adding our voice to the narrative, knowing that we can't change it by ourselves, but that's why we're not doing income requirements. We're not doing citizenship requirements, and we're really careful about anonymity. Yeah, there's this narrative of I'm working, I shouldn't need this.
Right.
But the system wasn't built to support people currently.
Right. And even I had an appeal last week with the unemployment from last year from the pandemic unemployment assistance. I'm an entrepreneur, so I'm usually not eligible for it. And I claimed one speaking gig that I got, and they're like, you're not willing to get a full-time job. And I'm like, this is my full-time job.
Yeah.
I'm in the meetings industry. It's not come back yet. And so I appealed it last August and I just got my hearing. And so it's a struggle, and it makes you feel demoralized. It doesn't make you feel whole. Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you brought that up. This idea of like, oh, you don't want to work, and only people who want to work are eligible for these programs. Like, yeah, we know that's really not the case. People want to work, and more than that, they want to feel whole, and they want to feel healthy, and they want to feel cared for. And the working environment is not necessarily built for all of us as well. And so how do we decouple attaching food and shelter to work and just saying like everybody to create a sustainable, cohesive community? We want everyone in our community to be housed and fed and have enough to be healthy and active and happy, as opposed to we want everyone to work. And if they are not willing to work, we don't want to help them.
Yeah. I mean, and it makes me think of that statement. Do you live to work or do you work to live?
Right.
And we do work to live, but we should have the ability to live.
Yes, completely. Yeah. And like, which one comes first, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And it really kind of puts things into perspective. But, when you have to work 3 jobs to make ends meet, and pay your rent and pay your cell phone bill so that you can maybe call your boss because your bus broke down or whatever. Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's kind of, we all take a lot of things for granted, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say I have some good news to share if you want to.
What is that? Yeah.
Okay. So I just finished researching this, and I'm so excited. There was a researcher at Oregon State University who looks at food insecurity in Oregon. He does periodic studies. And at the beginning of the pandemic, he published a study that said food insecurity rates are going to skyrocket. We were at the lowest that we've ever been in 20 years. We had 1 in 10 people in Oregon who are food insecure. And of course, much higher percentage for women and children and people of color, especially Black Americans. Mm-hmm. But 1 in 10, that's amazing. That's the lowest it's ever been.
Wow.
And because of the pandemic, it's going to be up to 30%. Crazy, wow. Huge rates. So during the whole time we were like working like so hard, food insecurity rates, 30%. Oh my gosh. He just released a study that said, actually, it didn't happen. Food security rates stayed the same, stayed at 1 in 10 because of everything that we did. Because stimulus checks, because rent relief, because of increased SNAP benefits, because of higher SNAP limit, and because of community programs like this one, we did it. Like we created a stronger social safety net and we caught people. Yeah. Which is so cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you wouldn't necessarily think that with what we see on the news, right? And that good stuff should be really screamed from the mountaintops, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And was that just in Oregon or is that across the country?
So that research was just in Oregon.
Okay.
It's on the Partners for Hunger-Free Oregon website, which is the research arm, the Oregon Food Bank. And it's researchers named Edwards from Oregon State. And I do wonder if it was nationwide or if some places that didn't respond in that way had different outcomes.
All right. Well, so everybody will get that link and post it in below this video when it posts so you can look at that. I think that's fantastic. It'll be interesting to see Feeding America, what their statistics are as well. I know they're very committed to it across the country to doing that, but that's fantastic. Congratulations. Yeah. So one of the things it's funny because, it's not funny, but I ask you what your greatest career accomplishment was or is, and you're still in your 20s.
Yeah. Right? Well, I'm 30. I just turned 30. I wear it with pride.
Good. Thank you. I mean, so you're 30 years old, and I'm so proud of what you've already done. I mean, it's really empowering to see this and to see that people in their 20s and 30s are pushing forward with these different kinds of support and community initiatives that create inclusion.
Yeah. Yes. I think there's a really interesting conversation tension that I'm noticing that also food scholars, there's a really great book called, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the title now. It's by Katie Martin and it just got released. It's about food banks and food pantries and kind of updating what the emergency food system is. Mm-hmm. I'll find the title and send it to you. But she talks about this, that there's people who are now benefiting from these training programs, going to university and getting trained in sustainable food systems and urban studies, which is my background. And then we're going into the community and we're saying, it's all wrong. Like, what's going on? And we're interacting with food bank and food pantry and soup kitchen managers who started the programs. And it's their baby. And they've been working so hard for 50 years with this amazing program. And they've done it, bootstrapped their way up. They fed hundreds of people, thousands of people sometimes with shoestring budgets and dedicated their life to this. And then here we come, like, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
And so how do we learn from our elders and hold their work compassionately and authentically learn from them and also shape the future into what we want to see for our kids? And then how do we step aside when the next generation comes up and it's like, you're doing it wrong?
So I just found it on Civil Eats. It's time to reinvent food banks and pantries, new tools to end hunger. Okay. I'll post this article. Okay, cool. And my friend Emily Brown, she is a mom who utilized WIC program, but her daughters had food allergies or do have food allergies, I should say. And she couldn't buy food for them in the regular food pantry. And so she ended up starting the Food Equality Initiative in Kansas City that is specifically geared toward families who are food allergic and celiac disease. And she just stepped down as the CEO to start a Free From Marketplace Incorporated, which is with a mission to provide everyone with affordable, inclusive access to food, to right foods and resources they need for their health. But one of the things that I learned from her, which I thought was quite interesting, is that the way that the program is written, it says whole wheat bread. And so on the WIC program, she wasn't allowed to buy gluten-free bread because gluten-free bread doesn't have wheat in it. So she's working to change the terminology to say whole grain bread. So that's just those little tiny nuances, which way back in the 1970s, when this was all started, again, we're not bashing the forefront, the people who started these programs. It's just now new because, like you said, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have internet, right? Things have changed.
And we weren't as aware. I mean, people lived their whole lives feeling terrible and not knowing why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and when you did answer my question about the accomplishments things, you said you're working with the local government now. So tell us about how the program is working with the local government.
Yeah, so nothing's set in stone yet, but I think because of my privilege, honestly, and because of my position, because of who I am and my background, I've been able to just go to the local economic development agency here and other local government agencies and departments and just say, this is really critical. It's really important. I'm not trying to take away funding from really important social service volunteer programs that exist, but I do think that this system is an added layer that is worth investing in. And it's not just about this program. Like, it's a whole food system overhaul that needs to happen. Nice. And I'm not attached to this one way of doing it. We do know that people who work in food service are majority people of color. It's the most sector of employment in Oregon, except for ag. And same with owning a restaurant. It's the highest percentage of people of color own restaurants in the nation than like any other type of business. Yeah. So
that's interesting.
Yeah. So how can the local government and governments at different levels step in and say, this sector is really important. And we know that supporting this sector will have cascading effects for equity throughout the whole system. And I feel super privileged and a little scared, honestly, to be able to have these conversations. So we're meeting with the development agency. There were pretty intense wildfires in Oregon last summer. And because we had built these relationships with restaurants, the restaurants in town had to shut down because there was really bad smoke in our town.
Okay.
And so they all shut down again during the pandemic. It was terrible. And they had all this food that was going to go to waste because who knows when you're going to reopen. So they just started doing what they know how to do, cooking. And they contacted us and was like, hey, can you, we're not asking for a donation, but can you help us pay for some of this or pay for our labor? And we said, sure. And then we realized, there's this whole emergency management arm of the government that just stepped into action, and they got the Rotary Club and they got the Elks Club and they got volunteers to go to the fairgrounds and cook food. And they're having volunteers, older adult volunteers during the pandemic, cooking food in smoke-filled conditions. We don't know if they have food handlers cards. We don't know. We can pay restaurant workers who would otherwise be out of work to cook the food that would otherwise go to waste. And then we can work with the emergency response agencies to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts and we're filling in the gaps of the Red Cross and the Salvation Army and getting the food to those in tents under bridges because our restaurant folk are going to go there with their delivery vans.
Right.
So there is a benefit to being able to talk with the mayor and talk with people who are living in tents under bridges.
Right.
Just two totally different groups.
And it does take some finesse to be able to do both. And so kudos to you for being able to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have different jackets or hats.
Right. Or hats. Yeah. Different shoes too. Yeah.
And with the realization that some people don't have that. They weren't, they're not able to do that, and through no fault of their own. But just how do I use that to be able to code switch in that way?
Right. Okay. So since it's Women's History Month, and we've got 5 more minutes.
Okay.
I wanted to ask, what words of wisdom did your mom, your grandmother, and maybe your father gave you to help you succeed?
Yes. Good question. Oh, where to start? They're all so wise. I will say I grew up in volunteering with my grandmother at the local soup kitchen. We would prepare food for the unhoused people once a month. And then we always did Christmas dinner because we're Jewish. So it was we'll do this day. And then my mom has a really difficult time with food. So I definitely learned from her that for everyone, it's not easy. And it's not just walk into the kitchen with confidence and feel free to make mistakes. And I really appreciate that lesson from her. And then my dad is a very confident cook, but he has very particular tastes. I think from him, I learned that there's people with really particular tastes and they feel very comfortable in their flavor profiles. And if you offer them something that they don't like, they'd rather go hungry than eat that thing. And I totally get that as well. But I think also my mom and my grandma are master volunteers, and they grew up volunteering however they could. So I think when the pandemic hit, having that cultural training of I do what I can right now with whatever skills that I have. I think that's directly from them.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now there's one term in there that you actually taught me a month ago that I want to highlight for people, but is the unhoused.
Oh yeah.
Instead of the homeless. And I love that terminology. And can you tell people about that word for me?
Yes, sure. So I think it's personal preference. I think that I was just having this conversation with my supervisor because we were doing focus groups with homeless or unhoused people. But, people are saying I'm not homeless because I can make a home wherever I am. I can make my home in my car. I can make my home from my backpack on my back. I can make my home in my 2 grocery bags, or I can make my home in my mansion that I finally got because my luck turned. But as opposed to being homeless doesn't necessarily fit how they're feeling, as opposed to being unhoused. You don't have a house, but you're able to make your home. But I will say that it's really personal preference. And some people on the street who we spoke with were like, no, I'm homeless. That fits me better. So I think just being responsive to whoever you're speaking with face-to-face and using their language back to them will help build those connections and help be more cohesive.
Well, and I think that's thinking about it in that perspective, and even thinking, going back to your mother and your grandmother doing volunteer work and you continuing that legacy within your family, no matter what that is, whether you're homeless or you're unhoused, we all still need to eat, and food is still that connector. And through the volunteer work that you did with your grandmother in the soup kitchens and to doing what you're doing now, it really is the food is that no matter where you are, you have to eat.
Yeah. Yep. And it's really best if you can eat with someone.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. It's such an important, I look at it as like the gateway drug. Like if you start feeding people, you're going to start thinking about a whole lot of other empathetic things with them. But start with a meal. Start with sharing a meal.
Yeah. And one of my other guests is like, you can't share a meal with an enemy, or you can't not share a meal. I'm like, she actually encourages people to eat down with somebody they don't like or that is an enemy, and see what that meal brings.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, because it does, when you break bread with somebody, literally or figuratively, it does change how things might be perceived.
Yeah, if I have time, there's another really quick thing that I think the HERstory Corvallis program does really well, which is break down the stigma of who deserves restaurant food and who doesn't, by totally taking away that label. So people who have $0 in income can still get a restaurant meal using this program, and the waiter and waitress don't know, and they still can get tipped. And people who maybe have never been to a restaurant or haven't been to a restaurant since their luck turned are able to just feel normal again. Right.
And a home cooked meal, even though it's from a restaurant, is a home cooked meal.
Yeah. Yeah. And sitting down it's just so comforting to sit down with other people chatting around you. Even if you're eating alone, you're not alone. You're in a restaurant and somebody's caring for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really important, that the food is caring for you and someone is serving you no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah. And they don't know. So they're not going to treat you differently.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So my last question is, how do you want to be remembered in history?
Oh my gosh. In HERstory?
HERstory, yes.
I hope that people just have this vague idea that like during the pandemic, there was something that happened that felt good. And we don't really remember who it was, but next time something terrible happens, maybe I'll try to start something good too, because that felt good for me.
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, Aliza Tuttle, thank you so much. And for everybody who's tuning in at the very last minute, Aliza works for It's On Us Corvallis, which is in Oregon, and she helps feed people. And thank you so much for the work that you do. And I look forward to seeing where you go next.
Thank you. I really appreciate your time, Tracy. This is so fun.
Well, I'm glad that you could join me. So everyone, and actually I'm glad you piped in when I asked who do I need to interview. So thank you on that Facebook group. I really think it's a fantastic program. And so kudos to you and your coworkers on that, or your co-volunteers.
Co-volunteers, yeah.
Yes. So everyone, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. So tune in, tell your friends to download it on every podcast platform. And until next time, stay safe and eat well. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.